this podcast, you'll find interviews with high-performing, successful individuals in life sciences. On a weekly basis, we cover their proven methods, principles, strategies, and mindsets to implement new technologies that scale to meet the needs of people in our world.
This episode of Life Science Success is brought to you by 5280 Life Sciences Consulting. If you need help setting your strategy, meeting your operational goals, or are selecting and implementing critical technology in your business, we should talk. Visit 5280lifescience.com to schedule a meeting and find out more.
Today, I'd like to welcome to the podcast Rebecca Costa. Rebecca, welcome.
Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think we're going to have just a great conversation between your books and other things. Could you just spend a little bit of time and tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Oh, good grief. I wish I had a Reader's Digest version. Let's see. I am a alleged, and I say alleged, expert on fast adaptation in high failure rate environments. And I remember coming back from the university and telling my father that, and he said, that's just the sort of thing that makes people move away from you at cocktail parties. And since we're in COVID now, I don't have to worry about that. There are no cocktail parties. And everyone is interested in fast adaptation. And because in a situation like this where you find a sudden sea change is upon you, you really need to draw upon tried and true methods for being able to pivot successfully. And some organizations and companies and individuals will make it and some won't. It's every other sea change in nature. So that is my background. My parents happened to land in what was to later become Silicon Valley. We didn't know that. After the fact, it's great to say, gee, it's fantastic that they decided to plunk their home in suburbia, but it became Silicon Valley. And of course, the jobs that were available when I got out of college were all in tech. But my background in sociobiology, which is really evolutionary biology, really allowed me to watch what was happening in terms of the acceleration of progress, how fast we were generating data, how fast change was beginning to occur. And I was haunted by this idea that physiologically we're not able to evolve very fast, that there seemed to be two clocks that were banging heads. One was the rate at which we could physiologically adapt. In other words, our brains could grow and adapt and be able to be functional in a fast rate environment. And then the other was the rate at which change was occurring. And I was fortunate enough to start my own company and have worked with some of the greatest minds in Silicon Valley. At the time, they didn't know that. They didn't know they were going to become legendary. And I started my own company, sold it, and retired. And I've discovered that I had something in the neighborhood of 200 notebooks that I had been keeping notes of. And this constant theme was weaved throughout the notebooks as technology was changing. And so I decided to write a book, The Watchman's Rattle. I took it to my longtime mentor, E.O. Wilson, the great naturalist out of Harvard University. And I think Ed's probably written something in the neighborhood of 50 or 60 books. And I said, would you look at this manuscript? I think I have something here. And he gave me a really big smile. And he said, what took you so long? And I didn't know if I had a book in me, to be really frank about it. It was a dark horse, a science book about evolution and technology. When the publisher asked me how many copies I'd sell, I told them, I'm pretty sure my family will buy a copy. And that was my answer. Truthfully, that was my answer. But it hit the top of the Amazon bestseller list. It was translated into 27 countries. And then, of course, the pressure was on to write a subsequent book. And I certainly didn't think two books were in me, and that has started somewhat of a publishing career for me. And that is very unexpected. I'm 65 years old, and I really didn't expect to have a writing career and a public speaking career and a corporate consulting career this late in my life. But everybody is under the gun right now to adapt more quickly and more efficiently. And it turns out that all those years ago when my dad opened up the newspaper, that's where you looked for jobs in those days, and said to me, nope, I've looked. There's no jobs for sociobiologists. There's jobs for dental assistants, accountants, administrative assistants. He said, but I checked, no sociobiologist. And he says, what's your plan?
Are you going to be
there you have it. I came from a working class family, and paying rent was at the top of your list when you got out of college.
Yeah, I remember lifelong students as well is one of the professions that I think most parents were most fearful of as well. One thing you didn't want to have is to have your child just continually stay in college and never move through and actually start a career.
Well, I'm right there with you. To put myself through college, I was a checker in a grocery store that was right near the campus so that I could ride my bike to the grocery store and ride my bike to classes. And when I realized that the other two checkers had PhDs, I knew I was in trouble.
Very good. And so you hit on it there. Let me just rephrase it a little bit for the listeners as well. So you're an American sociobiologist that also is a technology futurist, correct?
Yes, that's correct. I don't talk to dead people, and I don't read tarot cards. When you use the word futurist, it sounds like one of those woo-woo science occupations. My job is really looking at predictive analytics. I tell people if 100 numbers, it's not too hard to guess what 101 is going to be. And if you have billions and billions of data points, it's not that hard to know what the next most likely event is going to be. And that is what I work on.
Very good. And it's interesting because a lot of the focus of this podcast is around life sciences and where we're going. And for sure, both the artificial intelligence aspects of your future technology components, as well as, just looking at predictive analytics in terms of thinking about where science is going to take us next. And I know you touched on a couple of these things, at least in one of your books. And so I'm hoping that we get to dig a little bit deeper in those topics as well.
Yes. As we collect more and more data, it's not the data per se that's interesting. It's the patterns that are unveiled to us and what those patterns indicate about future events. And so, of course, the more data you have, the higher your accuracy is in being able to predict what those next events are. So I have said too many times, we have left the period in which we can adapt quickly. We are now into predaptation, which is effectively to be able to forecast what will occur and adapt before the fact. And that's the only thing that computing has been able to do for us that is socially significant.
Great. And in terms of whenever you talk about enablers for fast adaptation, what would some enablers potentially be?
Do you mean in terms of technology?
Yes. Yeah.
You mentioned one, artificial intelligence. That is going to be really critical for us because the human brain can only look at 5-6 things maybe simultaneously. That's on a good day. Whereas, and we cannot possibly take billions of data points and find the kinds of patterns that I love to watch these movies about these code breakers during World War II that would look for patterns and be able to break codes and things like that. And they were so basic and unsophisticated, the way that the codes were at that particular time. Now, without computing, you are prohibited from doing many things. So artificial intelligence and analytic algorithms are going to be extremely key. And some of those factors that are going into those algorithms really tend to surprise people. Like the level of your well-being, your happiness, your satisfaction in life has now become a bigger predictor of your longevity, how long you will live, than smoking is. And even some of the genetic inheritances of disease that you may be predisposed to. People are really shocked to hear that, but that tends to be your general feeling about your life, whether you score high on self-reported happiness and well-being or not, tends to be a higher indicator of how long you'll live.
Yeah, and one of the things that in your book on the Verge, you cite as well as you say that if physicians would have to spend something like 160 hours a week reading medical journals to remain current in their field. It's interesting to me to think that not only could we use technology to help with this, but also that there's a way of applying technology to thinking about some of the patterns that it's seeing and then combining that with the human capability as well. How would you propose that physicians might be able to keep up with kind of that flow of information? And are there things that you're seeing that really are going to help people in the future?
This gets back to artificial intelligence. It used to be if you had an emergency and you were rolled into the ER, maybe you got lucky and the best physician in the hospital happened to be on call that night. But let's say it was a new medical student that happened to be there when they were taking your intake information. The quality of care you were going to get was dependent on the education and whether that person just had a fight with their wife or husband, or they were in a bad mood, they got a pay cut. You just really didn't know. But thanks to IBM's Watchman and their first foray of using artificial intelligence in healthcare happened to be in ERs. And what they were doing is they were allowing people, it didn't matter who took you into the ER, you would go over to Watson and you would basically put in whatever was known about the patient. And then Watson would go out and comb all the medical science that's available online, every paper issued, every diagnosis, everything, and come back within seconds and be able to say, it's 89% the person has this, it's 62% they have this, it's 29% they have this, give you a list according to percentages of what the patient was suffering from. But the more important thing that artificial intelligence was able to do in the ER was to come back to the person and say, however, if you get me this piece of data next, I can increase the accuracy of my diagnosis by 98%. So it provided a pointer as to what was the next piece of data on that patient that was the most important and most critical in being able to save their life. And most, particularly in urban areas, most hospitals are using some form of artificial intelligence in doing quick diagnoses, and this is saving a lot of people's lives.
Yeah, so it's that time of year right now whenever most of us are looking for new healthcare plans and things like that anyway. And so as I think about the discussion right now with the insurance company about telehealth and the fact that I could have a physician on something that is like Zoom interviewing me for whatever malady that I might have, I guess the image that also pops in my head based on what you just said is that eventually a computer can honestly be doing a portion of that as well, if they're not already today.
Well, that's exactly right. We can tell a depressed person using a $200 facial recognition software package because you have 52 muscles in your face, and this is how humans are designed to express pleasure, displeasure, depression, obfuscating, and not telling the truth. All those things. And facial recognition software is relatively inexpensive. People are always shocked that for a couple $100 you can get a package. And I could be talking to you and saying, hey, I'm talking about this, and I've really noticed that Don is not real happy with what I'm talking about, so that I could switch gears. And so it's become very important in terms of healthcare. We're going to get very quickly, especially with everybody using Zoom and other internet video mechanisms to speak to their physicians, we're going to get very quickly where a physician's going to say, put your eye up near your phone. And everybody listening here probably knows this, that you can look into the eye and see if someone's got a serious heart condition and may be predisposed to a heart attack. And this happens very often when people go in to get eyes tested for glasses, where the examining physician will say, you need to get in to see your physician, your regular physician, because I believe that something is going on and that you may be susceptible to a heart attack or have had one. We're going to get very fast in being able to look at the pigmentation of your skin, right? To be able to look at your mouth, open up your mouth and look for certain tests. We may have you do home tests and look at the results together over video. These things are all coming, and they'll come a lot faster because of the COVID disruption.
Just this morning on the news, even they were talking a lot about for COVID, the new COVID home tests and things like that. And given the fact that we're not that good at quarantining ourselves, it's probably going to become more and more important that we do have that. So just to switch gears on you just a little bit. So can we talk a little bit about the amount of information constantly coming at us? And again, you said this a couple times, right? That in terms of human beings, we can only absorb so much. And it's interesting to me because I've taught quite a few college classes myself. I've done a lot of corporate facilitation and things like that. And one of the things that you frequently see are these people that seem to think that they can do multiple things at the same time, but honestly, we're giving, a lot less of ourselves to both activities whenever that happens. And so I look at Eric Schmidt's quote out of your book is something like roughly between the dawn of civilization until 2003, there was something like 5 exabytes or 1 billion gigabytes of data that we had about what sort of happened in those periods. Now that amount of data gets created every 5 days. And whenever I think about just that amount of information availability, it's challenging overall as a human being to try and figure out how are we going to absorb all of this.
That's right. The good news is we can't and we shouldn't. It is, our brains are, I tell people our brains are designed to understand barter, right? You have some carrots, I have some eggs. We meet in the street. We both bicker until we both think we got the better deal. We make the trade, and then suddenly I have eggs and carrots and you have eggs and carrots. Our brains really are at a level where we can understand that, we can manage that, we can navigate that. What we cannot do is we do not understand credit default swaps. And not just you and everyone listening here, just let's have a moment of honesty. I really like to have these truthful moments where you go to see your financial advisor and they start talking about this and that and this and that. And about 20% of it, you have no idea what they just said. And nor should you have to be an expert at managing your own money. I really think this idea of, hey, you better manage your money right so you can retire is just, it's such a high expectation because we don't really know what's going on. We don't know what's happening in the currency markets, in the gold markets. We don't really understand all these different kinds of mechanisms that they have on Wall Street. And moreover, we don't understand why something happens and all stocks go down at the same time. Right. That means the value of every company went down. And that's just incomprehensible. Our brains are just not designed. Our brains have not changed substantially for a million years, other than the frontal cortex growing very fast, quickly, in super speed, actually, in evolutionary terms. And so when we get this much data, we automatically need to turn it over and we need to have it interpreted and reduced so that it's actionable. Because the only thing important about that data is, can you give me the information I need to make a decision and to act on it? And if you think about it, this meld between machine and humans, it goes far past robotic arms and legs for soldiers returning from war. It also means an intellectual dependency. So you go out your door and your neighbor says, hey, you should get a rain jacket. It's probably going to rain this afternoon. And you walk inside and you say, Alexa, what's the weather report? And it says rain at 9 p.m. Now, do you believe your neighbor who put his nose in the air and says, I think it's going to rain? Or do you believe Alexa? We're at a point right now where we believe Alexa so much that it's become a point of marital arguments. Where, your spouse tells you something and you go, I don't believe you. And you go over and you ask Alexa and you believe Alexa. This dependency is not just on robots and mechanical devices that allow us to have artificial limbs and artificial hearts and so on and so forth, but it's also an intellectual dependency. And we need to really acknowledge that has already started.
Yeah, so I had 2 comments about that. My number 1 comment is that I guess my mind would instantly go to, what is Alexa's belief based in? So her belief could be based on the same sort of weather patterns that the weatherman is using. And so if that's the case, I don't normally trust the weatherman on the news either. And so I would probably opt for the neighbor who either is having a pain or seen a cloud or whatever more than I would Alexa. I guess that's kind of my first thought. And the second one kind of comes back to the point that you were more or less just making, that this idea of, the variety of information that constantly is flowing at us, right? The 4 V's were around velocity, volume, variety, and veracity. And I just look at the variety and our ability to sift through that and to really understand how we should be making decisions just doesn't seem to always be clear. We come back to the ability to predict the weather is probably about 30% maybe better than we can predict an election, since we just went through that as well in the US here. I have a feeling that our ability as humans, hopefully one of these days we'll be able to always leverage the technology, but also understand that we have some decision factor in the information that's constantly coming at us as well.
That's right. Data is just data. It's not a moral compass. And I don't get confused about that. But frankly, going back to my mentor, Edward Wilson, he said it, I think, most succinctly. He said, we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And that is the current state of humanity. When you put all that in a blender, it makes for tremendous confusion, right? Make no mistake, we're driven by Paleolithic emotions. And that really gets in the way many times of allowing the data to guide us. The current COVID situation is a classic example of Paleolithic emotions at play. It doesn't matter how much data is put out there about mask wearing or social distancing. You have people that are saying, you're infringing on my freedom. I have a right to infect everyone and everyone has a right to infect me. Effectively, that's their argument. And you have to understand that we're not that far out of the caves. We dig in, we're stubborn, we're greedy about things we shouldn't be, we cheat when there's an opportunity. You can throw all that technology in there, but you still have largely bonobo monkeys running it.
Yeah, so let me go to that point for a minute, because I thought that you were in, was it Santa Monica that you did your TEDx talk? Is that right?
Yeah, I believe I did a couple of different TEDx talks, but I think the one you saw was in Santa Monica.
Okay, and you talked about in that talk, and I thought this point was really interesting, right? That the humans realistically are only 2% away from the bonobo monkeys. And in reality, we've really leveraged the heck out of that 2%.
And it's not quantity, it's just the quality. We've broken down the human genome, and so there's no guessing. We have about a 2 to 3% difference in genetic material from a bonobo monkey. And think of what we've been able to do with that 2 or 3% compared to a bonobo monkey, which is why when people ask me about aliens in outer space, I tell them if they're just even 1% more advanced than us, they don't even have to be a lot. It could be a fraction of a percent. They're going to be about as interested in us as most people are interested in amoeba. The differences are going to be too vast for there to be anything of any interest in human civilization. Now, Ed Wilson argues with me on that point and says, but they'll be very interested in what makes us uniquely human. Not necessarily our technology or our science or our math, because presumably as we're getting further and further out into space, those things have held true. So they're going to know those things. They're going to have those things probably in better forms. But they won't have our art and they won't have our music. And all of those are unique to our species that developed here on Earth. I may be proven wrong by Ed Wilson, as I am so often proven wrong.
It's a great thing about mentors, right? Is that we do learn from them, and their knowledge is often much more aligned to reality than sometimes where we are overall as individuals.
Well, I can't stand it. Not only is he smarter and more brilliant and writes many more books than I do, he also has wisdom. So how fair is that?
That's a great thing. So I do want to talk about your 2 books, right? Just so that the listeners, if they want to go out and pick up your 2 books, can you summarize sort of the premise of the Watchman's Rattle and then the premise around On the Verge?
Yeah, I really urge them to pick up the Watchman's Rattle. They can pick that up at on my website, and if they mention your name, we'll make sure that they get a discount on that. The Watchman's Rattle was my attempt to look at what behaviors societies and individuals in that society were engaged in prior to the complete collapse, systemic collapse of the society. So I went back to the Mayans, the Romans, the Egyptian, the Ming Empire, the Roman Empire, to look at, I wasn't interested in the triggering event that caused those societies to collapse. I was interested in how the society was behaving that made them vulnerable to that triggering event. And I discovered 3 major stages, and I outline those in the Watchman's Rattle. And then I provide modern day examples of where we might be on that continuum. The stages are, first of all, the society becomes very complex. It becomes burdened by lots of laws, and people don't know where their food is coming from, where their water is being processed, so on and so forth. And they get removed from fundamental biological needs being fulfilled. The complexity grows and exponentiates so quickly that they reach what I call a cognitive threshold, where they can no longer distinguish an empirical fact from a unproven belief. And so the entire society becomes confused as to what is a fact. And then once that happens, the leaders then begin making public policy based on unproven beliefs, not on empirical fact. And once those 3 stages have been passed, then it's just a matter of time before some triggering event causes the society to go into unilateral collapse. And that's what I talk about in the Watchman's Rattle. In the second book that I wrote, because I didn't want everyone to be depressed, oh gosh, the sky is falling. As soon as we pass those 3 markers, we're done for. And a lot of people thought that I was some seer that could see the future. Because you got to remember, I wrote this book like 12 years ago, and then we started passing those road signs. So the second book I wrote to offer more optimism, and that is how artificial intelligence and predictive analytic models are allowing us to adapt before the fact. And that may be our saving grace. And in it, I confess that I trust machines much more than I trust Neanderthal humans. I don't trust what humans say as much as I trust the analysis of a machine. And even then, as you point out, you need to vet that, because depending on garbage in, garbage out, you can manipulate data in a machine. And we see that happening over social media and other kinds of mediums as well.
Yeah. And so I've interviewed quite a few leaders in life sciences in general. And it's really interesting to me, the future of where things might head in terms of an overall industry. You have new COVID tests coming. We have CRISPR, where they can potentially edit a gene and just totally shift the way the overall human behavior happens inside of the body. So that just totally could change the game. In addition to that, we have next generation sequencing, where they constantly are working on personalized medicine treatments and diagnostics. And so it just seems to me like the whole future around this could completely shift. And it's like what you just described. It's these sort of things that come from the periphery, not necessarily are central in your vision, in your line of sight, that we just oftentimes can't predict where things are going to go. And so I'd just be interested in hearing your thoughts in terms of the impact on where you see medicine and life sciences going based on some of the interactions that you've had.
I can tell you where it's going to go. 100, 150 years from now, we're going to look back on this idea that we cut people open and removed organs to save them is going to look so savage and so prehistoric, it will be unbelievable. Everybody got really excited that we had surgical robots suddenly were appearing inside of surgery centers. But the real holy grail are nanobots that are smaller than a human cell, that can be ingested through a pill. They're smaller than the piece of dirt that you eat with your salad. And they can be turned on, and they can be programmed to remove, for example, the plaque that occurs pre-Alzheimer's. They can be programmed to remove certain cancer cells. We will be curing disease from the inside out. And then once it has performed its function, it will turn itself off, and you will just basically eliminate it through waste. So this is what medical technology is working on right now, is not big robots and not surgical robots, but robots that you can ingest and from the inside out. Now, some of these robots have been tested in agriculture. And let me give you an example in agriculture how important this is. You spray a field and the plant ingests the nanobot, and the nanobot is communicating with the watering system to tell it when it needs water and how much water it needs. So each individual plant is able to communicate not only how much water it needs and when it needs water, but also what nutrients it's deficient and how much it needs in order to optimize its production. So in the same way that these nanobots from the inside out will be able to take all the metrics inside the body much more accurately than we can externally, and will be communicating in real time what your nutritional needs are. So imagine that you're a marathon runner and it's basically saying you're low on D and B1, and it's feeding to you what you need to optimize. Right? You've been working all day. You go to a drink machine. Let's say it's like a 3D printer. You go to a drink machine and a drink is waiting for you that is directly matched to what your nanobot inside your body is saying that you are deficient at that particular moment. Because that's the thing with personalized nutrition is it's changing second by second. As you use up minerals and as you use up calories, your nutritional needs are changing second by second. But imagine that drink machine can develop a drink and let you know that you're dehydrated, because we don't know when we're dehydrated. We just drink lots of water and we have no idea what we're doing there. But let's just assume that your phone gets pinged and it says you need a drink, and the drink has exactly the nutrients that you are deficient at that particular time. And not only that, the artificial intelligence happens to know that you like your drinks a little sweeter. So it's put a little extra, let's say, apple juice in there, right? So that it's now customizing the drink, not only to your physiological needs, but also to your palate. Because you're not going to drink or eat anything that doesn't taste good. We already know that.
That's right. That's absolutely true. As you started to go through that, I was thinking, so I used to run marathons, don't really do that much anymore. But the one of my favorite things was whenever there was an occasional alcoholic drink on the course as well. So of course I drank my electrolytes, I drank my water. I oftentimes would eat very sugary, gooey substances to try and replace some of the things that I'd lost on the course. But if a martini or a beer happened to pass by, I frequently would partake that as well.
Yeah, but I mean, how did you ask runners and you ask athletes, on what basis are you developing this menu? On what basis are you drinking these drinks? You don't really know what you're doing. We have to be honest about it. People go, hydrate. I'm going, to what level? I don't know if I'm dehydrated or not, but these are all things that internal mechanisms can report back, and then we can have devices that can customize. Because the holy grail is for something to be communicating to a device that can create what we need in real time. And that's what's being worked on. And in terms of timetables, I'm always off. I always think these things are coming 10 years from now or 20 years from now. And then next year I see it for sale on Amazon. It always happens much sooner than I'm thinking that it is. So I'm not very good in my timetables. But what I am good at is telling you what is going to happen.
Sure.
I might think it's 5 years out and it's really 1 year out, but I do know these things are under development, and I watch where that venture capital money is going.
Yeah, and I certainly don't know anything about nanobots and what people are developing there, but I do know that a lot of this industry has been very focused on the microbiome and what's happening in your gut in general. And what I hear you say that ties, at least for me, centrally back to a lot of the stuff that I keep hearing is that having food or drinks that are customized to you is probably much more important in terms of your long-term care and your long-term health anyway. And so that, to me, that makes an awful lot of sense. That
there's so much going on that's going to personalize and customize, even for women who are bearing children. I really became fascinated with these, I'm calling them bio bags, but they're not really, that's not the technical term for them. But at Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, what they've been doing is they've been removing the fetuses of lambs and bringing them to full term in bags, so that If you can imagine when they begin to do the human trials on this, which will not be very long from now, because we've had so much success with other mammals, that when you think about the number of women that can't carry a child to full term, and the danger that child has inside a woman who's moving around, working, climbing ladders, doing all of these things, you're really exposing your child, not only that, to secondhand smoke. Maybe you take a cocktail, maybe you're a drug addict, any of these things. But there is a belief that they could remove the fetus after 16 weeks and bring it to full term in a biobag by giving that child all the nutrients and everything it needs to come to full term. So these babies will be born literally out of a bag instead of carrying it in the mother. And people can go to Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and look at the research on lambs and ewes.
Interesting. We've come to the point in the podcast where I like to ask the same three questions of every guest. So, Rebecca, what inspires you?
The work that other people are doing. I'm always just in awe of the work that other fellow scientists are doing and their dedication and some of the discoveries they've made that never hit the media. In fact, most that never hit the media.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting to see, and it's interesting. Several of our guests have talked about newer companies or newer life sciences discoveries and the level of items that do make it to mainstream media versus the things that don't are a drastic few, unfortunately. And so
there's so much going on, and it's so much good for the planet and good for humanity. And the news media just really doesn't seem interested in it. And they drive what people are interested in. So that leads me to my greatest concern, which is if we allow the news media to narrowcast what humanity is interested in, the life sciences get left behind.
Yeah. Yeah, it's and tied very much to that is I heard the statistic the other day that 99% of adults outside of their high school education don't read. And I was surprised by that. And I don't know at what level or what sort of focus that they had, but 99% sounds like an awful lot of us that just consume things that are pushed to us versus things that we could reach out and grab ourselves. And,
that was one of the most shocking things when my first book came out, The Watchman's Rattle, was how many people wrote to me and said, I don't normally read and haven't read a book in 20 years, but my friend gave me your book. That way, and I'd think, is that even possible? I couldn't get past the first sentence to read the rest of it, which is, and I can't tell you how many people said, I don't normally read. I haven't read a book. I don't like to read. And they would start out that way. And I would think, wow, I'm not really understanding how you could not have, I don't know, a curiosity on how other people see things. Because even fiction, I don't read a lot of fiction, but every now and again, I'll pick up something that's fictional because the perspective on it is so interesting. And I'm a big believer that everything is like fertilizer, right? It's compost. You want to mix it all up because you don't know where that next good idea is going to come from. And
Absolutely.
You need a lot of fertilizer to grow one.
And I feel just absolutely tremendous things come from, at least for me, from books, because when I read, I hear my own version of that story, right? Not necessarily exactly the way that the writer wrote it, but the way that my brain interprets it. And it gives me the ability to really consume the information a little bit differently. And I have 3 grandsons right now. And it's interesting because the one thing that I most want them to walk away with is that when you see something in the world, there is a way for us to find out more, not necessarily just look at it and think that it's neat, but let's go figure out why does that happen or what is it that makes that happen? Because to me, that's how you create people that are curious enough to maybe pick up a book or maybe go read something more.
To that note, you can tell your grandchildren this story about Richard Feynman, the great physicist who was responsible in part for developing the first nuclear weapon in Los Alamos labs. In his biography, he confessed that he had no respect for artists because he didn't understand why they would just paint something, and they had no understanding of what created the colors in the flowers' petals and what the biological purpose was, and so on and so forth. He was a true science geek, but he happened to meet an artist in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the artist said, "Why don't we have lunch together, and I will try to explain to you why the flower is beautiful and why we want to paint it, and you can explain to me what makes the flower beautiful, what is the process, and why is it colorful, and how it attracts insects, and so on and so forth." And would you know that they had lunch once a week for the rest of his life, because he became so interested in being able to see that different perspective. And the artist also said he was made a better artist by learning more about the science of it.
That's a great story. For sure, I'll have to share that. And what excites you? So you told me what inspires you. You also told me what concerns you. What excites you?
I think all the new technologies and new sciences that are being developed, they're coming at us at such a fast rate. And it's hard to keep up. But every time I learn about a new discovery, I become fascinated, and it makes me want to learn more. So as you can probably tell, people say, "You don't sound like a scientist." You sound too happy and joyful and enthusiastic. But I think what keeps me this way is being able to learn about all these new discoveries and what a wonderful world we can be living in if we so choose to go that direction.
Yeah, I think it ties to your passion as well. You can hear the passion in your voice about what it is that you do and where your focus is. And Rebecca Costa, I wanted to thank you today for being on the show. I greatly appreciate your time and all of your insights and thoughts in terms of everything around our environment and where we could be heading. So thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you. And I hope everybody will go to www.rebeccacosta.com and watch the videos, and feel free to contact me.
Yeah, and so on the web pages, I will include all of your links. I will include links to your books and everything else as well. So hopefully through the podcast and other things, people can tie to you very quickly as well.
That'd be terrific. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Life Science Success. For complete details about this podcast, including show notes, how to get in touch with guests, and more episodes, please visit www.lifesciencesuccess.com. If there's someone you'd like for us to invite to the show as a guest, please let me know by sending me a message at the podcast website. Please click subscribe on your favorite podcast app, share the podcast, or tell a friend about it. And last but not least, rate the podcast. Thank you again.